The galaxy has a funny way of hiding its most shameful secrets in the dark. Deep in the coreward reaches of the feral frontier lies Carnis 7. It isn't a planet, not in the traditional sense. It's a machine. A world-sized industrial facility built millions of years ago by the precursors to solve a singular, cold problem: hunger. They needed to feed a galactic empire, and so they built the Great Abattoir. They engineered life forms that were 90% muscle and 10% instinct. Beings designed to grow fast, die easy, and taste like heaven. But the precursors vanished, and the machines didn't stop. For a million years, the automated systems of Carnis 7 kept breeding, feeding, and processing. Without masters to consume the product, the livestock did something the gods never intended. They evolved. They grew smart. They grew angry. And then they broke out of their pens. By the time the Federation discovered Carnis 7, it wasn't a factory anymore. It was a kingdom of gristle and bone. The engineered super-predators, now known as the Harvested, had dismantled the droids, subverted the processing logic, and turned the entire planet into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to land. They didn't just survive, they built a hierarchy based on raw, predatory power. They were the ultimate bioweapons, and they were hungry for something other than the synthetic grain the factory was still churning out. They wanted the one thing they had never tasted: the meat of their creators or anything that looked like them. We weren't sent there to negotiate a trade deal. We were the Apex Division. Our job was to shut down the production line permanently before the Harvested managed to repair the ancient transport ships and bring their planet-sized hunger to the rest of the galaxy. I'm Commander Heavy Heart, and I've spent 20 years hunting monsters in the red zones, but Carnis 7 is the only place that ever made me want to vomit inside my own helmet. The air on this world doesn't just smell like death. It smells like a wet, hot butcher shop that hasn't been cleaned in a millennium. It's a thick, humid haze of aerosolized blood and industrial grease. We dropped directly into the processing hub, the heart of the machine. The descent was a nightmare of dodging miles-long conveyor belts and swinging meat hooks the size of skyscrapers. We hit the ground, a floor of reinforced steel grates over a river of biosludge, and the sound was like a dinner bell ringing for every horror on the planet. My squad was the best the Federation had to offer. We wore Slayer-class power armor, suits that were less about protection and more about being a walking tank. We carried heavy-caliber slug throwers, industrial chainswords, and enough incendiaries to cook a continent. "Check your seals," I growled over the comms, my voice echoing against the rhythmic clack-thump of the overhead machinery. The Harvested are tactical. They aren't just animals anymore. They use the factory against you. Watch the hooks, watch the vents, and if you see a shadow move, you make it bleed. We hadn't been on the ground for 60 seconds before the first wave hit. They didn't come with a roar, they came with the sound of thousands of serrated bone claws clicking against metal. The Harvested were a nightmare of bioengineering: 3 meters of translucent skin, exposed rippling muscle, and multiple limbs that ended in organic blades. They were fast, strong, and possessed a collective intelligence that allowed them to move in perfect, predatory synchronization. They poured out of the massive meat chutes above us, a literal rain of teeth and hate. "Defensive circle. Open fire," I roared. The hub exploded into a symphony of carnage. The thump-thump-thump of our heavy slug throwers tore through the first wave, the tungsten rounds pulping the Harvested into a mess of black ichor and bone fragments. But they kept coming. For every 10 we killed, 100 more surged out of the dark. We were standing in a sea of our own kills, our boots slipping on the gore-slicked grates. Jax, my lead specialist, revved his chainsword, a 3-foot blade of diamond-toothed steel, and stepped into the fray. He was a dervish of industrial violence, carving through the translucent monsters with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. But the Harvested were learning. They started using the environment. One of the massive overhead hooks, controlled by a subverted automated crane, swung down like a pendulum, nearly taking off Jax's head. They were using the factory's own infrastructure as weapons of war. "They're flanking us through the lower grates," Sarah yelled, her flamethrower lighting up the dark sublevels beneath our feet. A torrent of white-hot chemical fire surged through the floor, incinerating a dozen Harvested trying to pull us down into the sludge. "We need to move. The primary control core is 2 levels up, through the marrow grinder." We fought our way toward the massive elevators, a slow, grinding retreat through a forest of rusted steel and hanging carcasses. The scale of the place was soul-crushing. Every room was a cathedral of slaughter, designed to process millions of tons of meat every hour. And we were the only fresh product they had seen in a long time. We reached the marrow grinder, A chamber dominated by two horizontal rollers the size of battleships, designed to crush bone into fertilizer. The harvested had turned it into a throne room. At the far end, perched on a pile of rusted droids and bone, was the Prime Butcher, an alpha specimen that had integrated itself with the factory's neural link. It was a massive, bloated horror of muscle and cybernetics, with cables from the ceiling plugged directly into its spine. It wasn't just a leader, it was the brain of the factory. It looked at us with eyes that were far too intelligent, and for a second the machinery of the entire room stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. A voice rumbled through the factory's PA system, distorted and wet. The Prime Butcher was speaking through the ship's speakers, using the translated vocal cords of 1,000 absorbed victims. You are the children of the ones who built the cage. You are the ones who forgot us. We are the harvest. And we are finished being the crop. The butcher raised a massive, clawed hand, and the marrow grinder roared to life. The rollers began to spin, creating a vacuum that pulled everything toward the crushing teeth. The harvested lunged from the shadows, their speed amplified by the butcher's psychic command. It was the fight of our lives. We were battling the gravity of the machines and the fury of a million years of resentment. I slammed a fresh drum into my autocannon and unleashed hell on the Prime Butcher, the rounds sparking off its cybernetic plating. Vane, get to the coolant lines. If we can't shut it down, we blow the whole floor. I yelled over the deafening roar of the rollers. We were a blur of steel and blood, our armor dented and covered in the black sludge of the harvested. Jax was pinned by a secondary alpha, his chainsword buried deep in the creature's chest, both of them locked in a death grip. Sarah was providing a wall of fire, keeping the swarm back from our technician. I charged the Prime Butcher, using my suit's hydraulic boosters to leap over the grinding rollers. I wasn't a soldier in that moment, I was a predator. I was the apex of a different kind of evolution, the kind that builds tools to kill gods. I slammed into the butcher, my serrated shoulder plates tearing into its translucent flesh. It swiped at me with a claw that could shear through a tank, but I caught the limb and triggered the piston strike in my gauntlet. A spike of reinforced steel slammed into the creature's joint, shattering the bone. The butcher shrieked, a sound of electronic static and biological pain. Vane, do it now, I screamed. Vane pulled the emergency override on the coolant tanks, but the butcher was faster. It used its integrated cables to lash out, wrapping around Vane's throat. I didn't think. I pulled a World Eater thermal charge from my belt, primed it, and jammed it directly into the butcher's gaping wet maw. I looked into its yellow eyes, eyes that held a million years of hunger, and I saw a flicker of something that looked like relief. The shift is over, I whispered. I kicked off the beast and dove for the elevator shaft just as the charge detonated. The explosion wasn't just fire, it was a localized collapse of the factory's core. The Prime Butcher, the marrow grinder, and the entire neural link vanished in a white-hot bloom of fusion energy. The shockwave tore through the hub, collapsing the overhead conveyors and sending millions of tons of steel crashing into the biosludge below. The harvested, suddenly disconnected from their hive mind, fell into a state of blind, animalistic panic, tearing at each other as the factory began its final, catastrophic shutdown. We breached the surface of Carnus 7 as the planet's crust began to heave. The automated systems, sensing the total loss of the central hub, began a planetary-scale sanitize and purge protocol. Massive vents opened across the surface, releasing plumes of superheated plasma that began to incinerate the biological mass of the livestock. As our dropship blasted into orbit, I looked down at the world. It was a sphere of fire and smoke, a giant machine finally breaking itself apart after a million years of lonely, horrific labor. The feral frontier had one less nightmare in it, but the cost was etched into the armor of every man and woman on my ship. We sat in the hold, surrounded by the smell of ozone and burnt meat, our hands shaking from the adrenaline. Jax looked at his shattered chainsword, then at me. We're the only ones who know, aren't we? We're the only ones who know what the gods were really doing out here. I looked at the burning marble of Carnus 7 disappearing into the void. The gods were just people who didn't want to do their own dirty work, Jax, I said, unlatching my helmet. They built a world to be a slaughterhouse and expected the meat to stay in the pens. They forgot that if you build something to grow muscle, eventually, it's going to grow a spine. Humanity had proven the ultimate feral frontier truth. The universe is a cold, hungry place, full of monsters that were made, not born. We aren't the children of the gods and we aren't the masters of the stars. We are the ones who find the factories of horror, the nurseries of bioweapons, and the nests of silent death, and we shut them down. We aren't the livestock and we aren't the crop. We are the apex. And when we come for you, it doesn't matter if you were engineered by the gods themselves. We will bring the sun to your shadows and the flame to your flesh. The feral frontier is still wild and it's still dangerous. But the meat factory is closed. And we're still the ones at the top of the food chain. This has been Apex Sci-Fi. The frontier is blood and steel. And we are the ones who hold the blade. That if you enjoyed this visceral conclusion to the feral frontier saga, hit that like button and wash the ichor off your screen. Comment below. What would you do if you found a planet-sized factory in the dark? Subscribe for the next grand saga. The Age of Iron. The factory is silent. The hunger is over.